Hello and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni, and today we're actually going to take a look at a fantastic email from one of our listeners. So excited because it's been a while, and I love that we've been getting emails. It's a little distressing because we've been getting enough emails that I feel bad that we have a little bit of a backlog. So we're going to hopefully get to a bunch of them very quickly. But today, we're going to look at one from a listener named Aaron, and Aaron is working on a kind of dark, grim, high fantasy. And I'm really excited about it. So I have the email right here. I actually have looked at the email already, but I haven't, I don't have notes in or anything, but I have an idea of what we're going to talk about. So don't worry. All right. So here's the email. Hello, Natalia Emmons and or John Negroni. Natalia has read this email, but it is me, of course, John Negroni. Hello. I need help with my dark/grimdark high fantasy story. I've written so much about the plot for my supposed 4-book series called Blackened Glass Swan. Very interesting title. My problem is I have 20 pages worth of just explanation for me to use for the story. And I don't know how to slowly incorporate it without having lore dumps or useless dialogue. Here are some of my questions. How to incorporate deep interlocked history between my characters so it feels like their actions are based on their past relations. How to, and this is two, how to incorporate subplots that make sense based on the surroundings and not make it feel that they are turned into the main plot instead of a subplot. Interesting question. And lastly, how do I make hope feel organic in my dark fantasy story and make it feel important based on their actions and surroundings? Thank you, Aaron. All right. So yeah, it's such a fun email. So we're gonna take this step by step and to kind of distill it down because those 3 questions are very interesting. There's a lot to them, but the first question really is getting to the heart of how to reveal deep character history. Okay, so that's the big thing there, and revealing deep character history without dumping too much lore. So that's the core of the first question. The second question, essentially, it's asking how do you keep the subplots from hijacking the main narrative, right? And then lastly, the third thing was how do you make hope feel earned in a world that is so dark? Right. I really want to get into this, but I also want to set the stage for those of you who may not know some of the nuances of what makes dark fantasy and how it differs from other types of dark fantasy, especially because we're talking about dark high fantasy. So that is a layer there that maybe not everybody would have all the words to describe. So we'll go through that. And grimdark is the other word for this as well. So think George R. R. Martin, R.F. Kuang are the big names in this kind of space. And I would say, too, if you are somebody who's writing dark fantasy right off the bat, I think a big misconception that people have is that it's all about misery, but I don't think that's quite right. I think the main thing with dark fantasy is that you are writing meaning within a very hostile world, right? That's where authors, again, like George R. R. Martin come in. That's where Joe Abercrombie comes in, who just had a new book come out. I haven't read it, but I'm not the biggest like Joe Abercrombie reader. I haven't read a lot of his stuff. Just I think the first book in First Law, and that was a long time ago. So one of these days, I need to catch up on Joe Abercrombie. I know he's well regarded for a reason. That's definitely one of my blind spots. But yeah, dark fantasy. So again, to set the stage, it's fantasy that some people would consider it's like, oh, it's more grown up. It's kind of what happens when you take the fundamental elements of fantasy, so like the magic, the quests, the kingdoms, but then you strip away all of the comfortable stuff, the comfortable certainties that defined the genre so long. Think things like plot armor. Why do people love Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire more broadly? Well, it's because anybody can die, right? Even the main character can die. At least that's how it was for, part of it. And so that was something that in traditional fantasy people weren't used to, right? The kind of traditional fantasy that Tolkien perfected, right, with Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, and all that. It gave us these worlds with very clear moral lines. You had your dark lords, you had your noble heroes, and your evil was purely evil. And good was always just, starlight good. And dark fantasy kind of turns that around and it asks, well, what if the world isn't so simple? What if it's a little bit more like our world, a little bit more realistic, and maybe even darker than our world in some respects? So that's pretty hard to do, as you can imagine. What if your hero, for example, has blood on their hands? Right? What if the king that you are fighting to restore to the throne, your Aragon or Aragorn, as it were, what if Aragorn was a monster, a terrible person, a Joffrey, right? In essence, dark fantasy is fantasy that acknowledges some very difficult truths, which is that power corrupts. Good intentions can lead to horrible consequences. Sometimes there are no good choices, right? Only choices between different kinds of terrible. And when, I try to write characters, or even, when I'm reading characters, like I want to stick with George R. R. Martin because one of the more famous examples, Jamie Lannister, Stannis Baratheon. Martin really explores those gray areas for those characters where traditional fantasy usually didn't go. Right. It either didn't have the room to go there or the world just kind of wasn't ready for that kind of thing yet. And we moved into a new era into the 80s, 90s, and today. And I think too that dark fantasy shouldn't necessarily mean nihilistic fantasy, right? It can, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It's not always about wallowing again in that misery or violence for the sake of it. It should, though, have consequences. Consequences are so baked into dark fantasy. When somebody dies, they should stay dead, right? When somebody makes a mistake, it should cost them something dear. And the world should push back when good things happen. And I think dark fantasy in general emerged because I think readers and writers like us, we kind of grew tired of this sort of thing collectively, where it would be these kind of like bloodless conflicts and happy endings were always guaranteed. Again, plot armor, right? Like nothing bad really happened to the main character. Everybody else around them, if somebody's firing and like the stormtroopers in Star Wars, like they have terrible aims, like that kind of thing. And people generally they started wanting fantasy that felt a little bit more real, even when it was impossible to do that. And we want to also explore the human condition through fantasy a little bit more than I think we used to, or at least in a different way. And doing it still with fantasy, so through the lens of magic and dragons and all that fun escapist stuff. So yeah, and I think too, for dark fantasy, you do also have to recognize that there is a light in dark fantasy, and it's about the contrast between the lights. Hope itself can mean all that much more because it's set in a fantasy where dark seems to be the prevailing mood. Okay, that's my dark fantasy 101, I guess. So at least that's how I'd like to describe it. I'm sure other people have their own methods. But let's get into Aaron's questions here. So Aaron wanted to talk about character history, and trying to avoid the lore jumps. How do I show these long complicated histories and backstories between characters without dumping exposition? And this is a long-standing question. It's very difficult to do. I do think, going back to Joe Abercrombie, I do think he did this pretty fantastically in the first law, because like characters usually didn't like explain their pasts. That they would really just kind of let their past bleed on the page, right? You had characters, like a character would have a limp, and that would tell you a lot more than necessarily a monologue would. There's characters whose traumas will kind of slip through their little offhand snide remarks. You get a little of that too with like Matt Calvin in Wheel of Time. And in a lot of these cases, it's not starting with the backstory at all. It's starting with behavior that sparks curiosity. Why is this character like this? And it's kind of getting the reader to wonder and want to know the backstory. And then you start to drip it in little by little. And I think my advice in general too would be, give your character a flaw, that comes from something unresolved in their past. You don't have to identify it right away. You can just let us see it interfere with that character, get in their way. Let us, as the reader, wonder. And when the past finally comes out, it should feel really earned, right? Seeing characters dealing something with very, difficult, like baggage and all that stuff. I do think that that's something that you can make happen without losing that thread, right? And I've talked before about how I personally love weaving in, or actually writing my own backstories for characters that never even see the light of day. But I like to do it so I have that context first and foremost. It's really helpful. The other question was talking about like subplots, trying to serve the narrative but not get in the way of the narrative, which can be difficult, right? Sometimes subplots can take on a mind of their own. First fantasy novel I did had, it had subplots, but it had kind of two main plots and it had subplots. There was a lot going on in that novel. And this one's definitely tricky, right? Because subplots often feel like they're taking over when they have their own stakes, their own characters, their own pace. But I think the key to it is to make sure you're always tying the subplot to the protagonist's core journey, whether that's like the abstract question, like the emotional question, like even if it's not physically or geographically connected, letting it be emotionally connected or emotionally similar is a way that you can make these things feel cohesive and organic to each other. In my own work, I like to use modular plotting sometimes. And so this is when every subplot kind of orbits the central question of the story. So what I kind of was talking about before, like either the major abstract question or the major dramatic question. So major dramatic question is going to be like will, be able to destroy the Death Star and save the galaxy? The abstract question is, will Luke trust in the Force? Right. So these are the big questions that drive the narrative. And if your book is about something like redemption, which would make sense in a dark fantasy, right? Then, you would have things like political intrigue. You would have wars sort of brewing on the border. And you would have maybe other, like, you would have like romances actually, like that could be happening. And each of these things can press against your protagonist's ability to redeem themselves or maybe other people. And so that way it does feel like these tangents feel like they're all building up to something, like they have some kind of momentum. I also think it's very, very important, and this is something that people mess up on all the time. Raise your hand if you've done it. Podcast listeners, that's me. Give your subplots a clear finish line. This is so important. A subplot without a resolution, it can sometimes feel lazy. It can feel like it's trying to just set up other books in kind of a cynical way. And yeah, I think that if you're mapping it out, this shouldn't happen, right? It's in outlining. I get it. Some people think it's not for them. There's a way to outline though that might be different than your preconception that can help you with these things. But yeah, map it out. Your beginning, your midpoint twist, and the ending, and ask yourself, what does this subplot do for the main arc? I can't tell you how many times I've been working on a book and I just cut subplots out. I'm just like, I have these characters, they're doing this, and yeah, it connects. Like but it doesn't connect enough to justify all these extra pages. And so I usually just cut out or I used to. I don't do it as much anymore. I've gotten a little bit better about it as I've, grown as a writer. But yeah, I would say ask yourself that question. What is this subplot really doing? And if the answer is not much, right? Maybe it belongs, maybe you don't cut it out entirely. Maybe it belongs in book two, or it belongs, in that little trash folder in the corner of your screen. And then the last question was about trying to make hope organic and feel like right, in a grim, dark kind of story. That's a big question, and it's a fundamental question of dark fantasy. Hope in our world can sometimes feel like, where is it? Like, how do you, like, who has it? I want to find some if you know where to get it. But this is, believe it or not, hope is the heart of dark fantasy. It's like I was saying before, the contrast between dark and light is every bit as important as the emphasis on the darkness, right? You can't really have a grim dark story if you have something to compare the darkness to. And a lot of grim dark stories I've read do collapse into nihilism, and everything is corrupt, everybody dies, nothing matters. And look, that can be a very powerful book for some people and for many people, right? But it's not for everybody, right? And for a lot of people, even who are open-minded to it, it's not always sustainable. For multi-story books, like typically books like that kind of work if it's like a standalone, but if you're trying to do like four books, I felt by the time you get to the second book, you're like, oh, everything's too sad. I just, I feel like I'm investing in something that's just, bringing about painful suffering for me. Because when you think about it, I mean, readers, they don't really want to connect to despair, right? They want to connect to struggle, not despair. They want to connect to things like resilience and fighting for something better, small victories, right? Even amidst all the big failures. And yeah, so, and in other words, hope matters more in a dark world because it's rare or rarer, right? It actually costs something to get it, and not everybody's willing to pay it. And my rule of thumb typically is to let the character really earn every hopeful moment. That really helps. Don't hand it to them. Don't let it be automatic. Really make them bleed for it. Really make them work for it. When they do get it, like, even if it's like the briefest smile on a character you don't see it coming for, or like one night where things are just safe, everybody's having a good time hanging out in the tavern, and there's no like big fight, but there's just like a game night. I remember, I think it's the first Song of Ice and Fire book. There's just this like little story that like Arya tells about the time she and her siblings, pranked. I think it was Bran. I don't even remember, but like it's just this fun little story about these, her recollecting on like how much fun she used to have with her siblings before everything went to, what. Yeah, it matters, and it feels all the sweeter, right? Because what's the context? Arya is often this, on her own, on the brink of death in every corner, right? But her focusing and thinking on these things really brings the light into the story too. So also, I mean, look at Poppy War or Broken Earth trilogy, Stormlight Archive. These stories aren't always about bright futures. They're really about broken people, right, who are trying to succeed anyway. And for a lot of readers like me, that's probably the most compelling kind of hope that you can find in modern fiction. So Aaron, thank you again for sending us this emails. I mean, this email, I think this question or these questions, I can't get my singulars and plurals. I think your questions are really telling me you care more about, or you care about more than just like world building. You care about readers. You're trying to give them an experience that really lingers with them, stays with them. And I love that. Keep going. I can't talk. Keep going with Blackened Glass Swan, a cool title. And don't be afraid to, maybe, cut, condense, rewrite, whatever you need to do to get it right. I'm sure you're trying to figure it out as we speak. So, but also don't forget, that sometimes the best way to move forward is to focus less on what you have constructed and more on, how your characters are breaking on the page, right? And why, even when they're breaking and they're at their lowest, why they still want to try to fix something anyway. That's really the spine of a book, in my opinion. Everything else is just kind of the fun, fleshy stuff. So yeah, if you're watching this and maybe you have a similar story problem in fantasy or something completely different, who knows, email us. fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com is how you can send us a line. You can also hop into the Discord in the show notes. That's where we hang out with writers and we talk about stuff, including the show, especially when I'm gone, busy doing other things and trying to publish some work here and there. But yeah, as always, keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.